Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses some potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're discussing the concept of modified response in emergency services. Joining me on the program today are Mike Baker, Dave Bradley, and Blair Tyndall from the Client Risk Solutions team. They're here to discuss modified response, what it means, and how your organization can integrate this concept into your operations. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Good morning, Chris. Thanks for having us.
Great to be here, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
So to start it off, we talked about modified response in the intro. Can someone elaborate and define what that means?
Yeah, Chris, I'll be glad to kind of address that as we start off this podcast. We just recently created a risk bulletin on this topic, and it is up on our website now. We get a lot of discussion from our customers on this, and it's something that we've seen kind of as a holistic approach to response in our ESOs. And it deals with how we respond to emergencies, getting out of the old trends that we have used for years of response, trying to look at an overall picture of what is causing us problems, what is dangerous for our agencies to respond to. And there are some finer points of that we need to discuss.
And Chris, I'll add to that from the VFIS program side of the coin here, is that historically, in the claims arena, we see very few claims resulting from a delayed response or a diminished response. Most of the claims that we have that are on the book, you can also obviously say are somewhat associated to a speed issue or just a driver that's kind of pressing the limits and doing his best to get there as fast as they can. So what this approach is going to do is reduce or diminish the number of times that traditional response is going to be afforded to that agency or that responder. Our hope is that we eventually reduce the number of those responses so that in turn, maybe we can have a couple more delayed response claims or allegations come through. That would be my hope. But the other side is the VFIS program. Everybody has probably been through a training at some point in time that's made the statement of, hey, slow down on your way to this call, because if you don't get there, your mutual aid department is the next due, and is certainly going to be a delayed response at that given time because you were involved in an accident because you were pressing the limits of the response trying to make it there. I'm not saying that there are not true emergency incidents. Those certainly are there, and we should be responding emergency to those. But in those situations where there's not a true emergency existing, maybe some concept or some idea should be given to reducing the risk that you're putting your personnel and your equipment in.
Blair, in your opening comment, you mentioned holistic approach. So can you discuss some of the benefits of modified response from a holistic approach for the ESO?
Sure. Just to piggyback, Chris, on what Mike just said about not only reducing claims and keeping your staff safe in an overall sense. It's really a culture change because we've all been fire and EMS providers for a number of years. We all really enjoy that emergency response. That's kind of why we got into the business. But it is a change in the culture. So there's a couple of people that you have to prepare and a couple of different agencies that have to be involved. So you don't implement this in a vacuum. You need to prepare the stakeholders. So one of the big stakeholders in this modified response concept is the communications center, or the 911 center, as it's called in many locations. So how they use things like EMD and EFD, how that is used inside the communications center, you really need to coordinate your intentions as an emergency response agency with the communications center so that you and that agency are on the same page. We work with these folks every day, but a lot of times we don't take the time to figure out what their challenges are inside the communications center versus what we see out on the street. And once you sit down and have a meeting with those folks, you can understand what they're after, what their goals are, coordinate those with your goals, and then consider really using that pre-arrival information as a way to modify the response. Downgrade the response is another word that we hear quite often. But there are a lot of people in this that need to be included in and not just implement it and hope everybody catches up.
So we've defined what modified response is, and we've talked about some of the benefits. So what should an ESO consider when implementing a modified response program?
Another part of that would be preparing your responders and the personnel that are actually running the vehicles out into these situations. I think we've said earlier in the podcast that traditionally it's always been every call is an emergency, and I think as we become more seasoned providers, I think you talk to some of the folks who have been doing it a while, not everything is truly an emergency. But when you first get in, as Blair explained, you get into it for the purpose of it's neat to run emergency and be a hero and help those folks who are in dire need of some assistance. But I think it comes down to educating and preparing the responders to say, it's okay to, based on dispatch information, diminish that response level to a non-emergency, and make sure that you're going to make it there to assist them and to provide that service, even if it's not a true emergency.
So what about how do we prepare the community, because they may be involved in it? And I'll give an example for an area that I cover. It's more the reason that they modified their response was more from the community's perspective, because they are southern Louisiana, so it's a road right along a bayou. So they would see the lights and sirens coming up behind them, and cars were literally driving off the road into the bayous, and so they were creating more hazards by just trying to do the right thing and get out of the way. So can you speak to how we need to educate the public and get them involved in when we go through this modified response?
Yeah, Chris, that's a great point. And when you think about preparing the community, it is a concerted approach back to all the stakeholders, your 911 center, your elected officials, the folks that make the policies for the response area. But preparing the community, making them aware that there are times they're going to call 911 and they're going to be told the ambulance and or fire truck are going to respond non-emergency depending on what the information that they are obtaining. It's really important that they understand that, because a lot of the public decides, hey, I'm going to call 911 and they're going to be here in no time. And there are times, as we've been talking about with modified response, where they don't need an emergency response. And that becomes a push from the dispatchers, explaining that to the people when they're on the phone. But more importantly, before implementation, a public relations campaign that makes sure everyone understands as much as possible what the change is and what that will mean.
And Chris, I think the other side too is what folks need to recognize, both all three of these categories, the responders, the stakeholders, and the community, is an emergency response time is not necessarily diminished by much. I think there's a lot of studies out there that publish this, and a lot of them are anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes for a response delay if you go non-emergency to that scene. And again, based on the information that's contained in that call or that 911 call to the communications center, really, I think it's warranted that maybe we consider diminishing some of those responses on various types of incidents. The other side is from an accident or incident rate of emergency vehicles and personnel getting involved in incidents with either fixed objects or other vehicles out on the roadway. By doing a modified response program, we've seen results that diminish those occurrences by at least 50%.
Another thing too, that I have one very large provider that is a metropolitan area. They actually did a county-wide campaign that involved the fire department, EMS, and the law enforcement provider, and the 911 center. And they spent minimal amounts of money to put stuff on billboards as to educate the public as what's an emergency. When do I call 911? And following up on what Dave said, if you need help in this particular type of emergency, you can expect that we're not coming emergency traffic. It's going to be a longer, more delayed, precise response, that we're not going to risk that benefit versus the reward. So it's really important, too, to always continue to educate the community.
And I want to go back to one thought I had on preparing responders. Go back to the first time you took EVOC and hopefully, or driver training, and hopefully you had a good instructor that really pushed the 4 priorities of a response. You're always number 1. Your crew is number 2, and 3 and 4 get mixed up a lot. Everybody, not everybody, but there's a percentage of people that believe that the event is number 3 and the public's number 4. And that needs to be reversed. The public is number 3, and until we take care of 1, 2, and 3, we cannot get to 4. So emergency or non-emergency response, the 4 priorities really come into play.
So are there any QA program enhancements that need to be considered as part of implementing a modified response?
Great question, Chris. And I work with several EMS departments that have aggressively evaluated their emergency transport of a patient. So patient on board using lights and sirens. And these organizations have added a component to their QA program that gets looked at by the QA team and the medical director to say what was the clinical indication to transport that patient lights and sirens. And those organizations have been able to reduce their lights and sirens transport to the hospital down to about 2 or 3%. And nearly all the ones that occur with good intention. So that's one of the QA pieces on the EMS side is just why are you transporting those patients' lights and sirens?
That's a very good point, Dave. And I think if most EMS providers will reveal or dig into their QA stats, we typically see that about 10 to 12% after the fact, when we do QA, that about 10 to 12% of our calls are demanding ALS level intervention. So if that's the only ones that are demanding ALS, then you can see that there's a great benefit in reducing your response and rolling those stats back into exactly what you just said.
So that's a lot of good information on things that we should consider when we're, looking to implement a modified response program. But what are some examples for an ESO to consider using a modified response scenario in their responses?
Chris, this is something that should be under constant observation by the organization. But, a few that come off the top of my head would be, things like, water shuttles at a barn fire. There's really, if you have adequate water supply with, a numerous amount of vehicles involved, and running those shuttles, there's absolutely no reason to be running lights and sirens between a water source to that scene. That's just one that comes to mind. The other thing is when I was a young guy sitting in a dispatch center, you see these battalion boxes on small type things, automatic fire alarms or a furnace malfunction, things of those nature. And the dispatcher was sitting there saying, little Mrs. Smith thinks she's going to get a little fire truck show up at her doorstep, but what she's really ended up with is, a battalion box and 8 different fire trucks that are coming screaming from all different angles to that alarm. I think each service or entity needs to evaluate how they operate in their given areas and figure out what they can do to maybe put 1 or 2 vehicles in the street hot and then run the rest until something is confirmed or taken back on that dispatch information that would change the ultimate way that they're responding to that incident. Does anybody else have any other scenarios?
Yeah, there's several that come to mind. And Mike, that was a great example of, an occupied dwelling during the day that's an automatic fire alarm. For the most part, somebody's going to call 911 if there's actually smoke or fire. So getting that first vehicle moving emergency and everything else backfilling that's coming non-emergency, they're still on the street, they're still rolling. And as Mike alluded to earlier, we don't save a lot of time with lights and sirens. Some other ones that come to mind, carbon monoxide detector without illness. Especially we're now approaching winter, and we see a lot more carbon monoxide detector activations. And when they call 911 and nobody's sick and they're evacuating to the outside, that can be another time to back down that assignment to either modified response of 1 vehicle emergency or no vehicles emergency.
Yeah, and some other good just examples of call types, trash fires, rubbish fires, that are outside of a structure where there's no structure involved. even some wildland fires that are not threatening life or property are something that we could certainly change that on. And, transfer assignments, when we're moving vehicles, staging vehicles, and those kinds of things, those are pretty obvious, but, there's still considerations there as to how we complete those assignments.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for your time this morning. It was a lot of great information, as always, something for our clients to consider, a new concept in emergency services. So I want to thank you for highlighting some things that they should look at when doing so.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Always a pleasure.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guests Mike Baker, Blair Tyndall, and Dave Bradley once again for their time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by emailing VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Glatfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees. Additionally, all views, information, or opinions expressed are provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, medical, or other professional advice on any subject matter.